Hi, welcome. You're here for the Future of Transportation Funding panel. We're going to wait just a couple moments as folks are joining and tuning in this morning. Thank you for being here. And if you see your chat bar, we're asking that folks go ahead and introduce yourselves. You can say your name and where you're joining us from. Welcome. I see our participants are joining. We're just going to take the first couple of minutes and let people log on and sign in, and then we'll be getting started. But you're in the right place. This is the Future of Transportation Funding panel at the Washington Bike Walk Roll Summit. So thank you for joining us today. And as you're getting settled, we'd love it if you would share your name and where you're joining us from, just so folks have a chance to see. This is one of the benefits of having a virtual summit, is we can welcome people from further regions. We'll be getting started in just a minute here. Okay, great. Well, I think we'll get started, and if you're tuning in or logging in, we'll just continue to be doing introductions here for the first 10 minutes or so. So thank you for joining us. You're here today for the Future of Transportation Funding panel. And I'm going to start with some introductions and a slide deck to just walk us through kind of setting the stage here today. So I'm Alex Alston. My pronouns are she, her, and I lead state policy efforts for Washington Bikes in Olympia. And welcome to the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit presented by Amazon. We're so excited to have over 500 registrants for this 5-day virtual event. And we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. This summit is virtual, and so we are on many lands, but Cascade and Washington Bikes are rooted on the lands of the Duwamish, the Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish, and we acknowledge the land we sit on and occupy today as their traditional home, and without them would not have access to this environment. And then we'd also like to note before we get started that we are recording this session, and so this will be available following the summit. The summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and also Washington Bikes, which are two sister statewide nonprofit organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington state, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding events and rides. While Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates and ballot measures, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 15 panels with expert speakers with registration free for all attendees, which was very exciting. Thank you to Amazon, our presenting sponsor. And we'd also like to thank our supporting sponsors, the Washington State Department of Transportation Active Transportation Division and the Eastern Washington region. Thank you also to our general sponsors, the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration, and also Stacy Bain, bike lawyer. And with that, and before we transition into this summit session this morning, we'd like to take a moment to articulate community expectations we have for all of our summit sessions. And so we will maintain a standard of conduct to ensure that all participants feel safe and respected, and believe that every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect, and free from all forms of harassment. So we are asking today that you, as participants in the session, be fully present in the session, be self-responsible, to listen and process, to suspend judgment, and to use respectful language towards each other in the chat bar, also to our wonderful panelists. And if you do have any questions or concerns during the session, please feel free to reach out to the chat monitors. We have 2 people monitoring the chat function, and you can send a personal message through the feature on the chat bar. Okay, and now I'm going to quickly introduce our session and panelists. So you are here for the Future of Transportation Funding panel. I am very excited to introduce our esteemed panelists. We are joined this morning by State Senator Rebecca Saldaña, who serves as Vice Chair on the Senate Transportation Committee. And we also have State Representative Vandana Slatter, who is also Vice Chair on the House Transportation Committee. And also Governor Inslee's Senior Transportation Policy Advisor, Debbie Driver. And we're looking forward to a conversation around that's going to explore potential transportation revenue, proposals, and new funding opportunities, while also addressing the unique challenges that we are here in 2020. And really quickly, before we dive in, just for your information, this is the framework of our conversation today. We're currently doing introductions, and we will then move into questions and discussion of our panelists, and then there'll be time for audience Q&A. And just because that time's set at the end, you do not need to hold your questions until then. Please do engage and be sending questions along as the conversation's unfolding. And then the last item before we jump in is that this is our first time doing a virtual summit, and we are very interested to hear your feedback. And so at the conclusion of this panel, there will be a Google form shared in the chat bar. And if you are so inclined, we would very much love to hear your thoughts. And so I will stop sharing my screen, and I am going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And if you would introduce yourself, describe your role in relation to transportation. I know you wear many, many hats. And then also share who your constituency is as well. And if we could start with Senator Saldaña.
Okay. Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I am joining you from Rainier Beach on Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Salish coast lands, and I represent the 37th Legislative District. I have a picture of one corner of that district here behind you from International Chinatown, but my district borders the Madison, so I am south of Madison, including Central District, and goes down, includes Harborview, includes the stadiums and a little bit of Pioneer Square. And then it goes up onto 15th and includes the east side of 15th, which includes El Centro de la Raza and the Beacon Hill Light Rail Station, all of Rainier Valley, and then up on the hill where I live, which is Skyway, Rainier View, and then unincorporated King County, and then downtown Renton, and hugs along the Lake Washington just before you get to Coulon Beach and everything. So that is my district, and I have had the honor to serve in the Senate. I was appointed in 2016, so my first session was 2017, and joined as a member of the Transportation Committee, and then when the Senate Democrats took majority, I became the vice chair of the Transportation Committee, and also serve on Labor and Commerce, on Housing and Affordability and Stability, and serve as the deputy leader for our Majority Caucus.
Would you like me to go ahead?
Rep. Slatter, would you go next? Yes, thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Vandana Slatter. I represent the 48th Legislative District, and it is across the water from Lake Washington on the in East King County. Mostly my district looks like parts of Bellevue, Redmond, and Kirkland. And I do have Marymore Park and the Westlake Sammamish Parkway. I also represent Clyde Hill and Medina and the Points communities. We have a lot of different parks, but one of the things that we really would like to have is much more connectivity with bicycling. My positions in the House chamber are Vice Chair of Transportation. I also sit on College and Workforce Development, and I sit on Innovation, Technology, and Economic Development. I have not been on the Transportation Committee for my full 4-year term, but so far. But you know, the challenge of working on the transportation package this year will be, I'm sure, something we'll discuss. I look forward to hearing your questions and concerns. Thank you.
And Debbie, would you?
Good. Thanks. Good morning. Thank you for having me join you today. And it's great to be here with Senator Saldaña and Representative Slatter. My name is Debbie Driver, and as Alex mentioned, I am the Governor's Transportation Policy Advisor. And my role here at the Governor's office is to provide policy advice on the transportation budget, which is quite a large document, if you will. It includes WSDOT, State Patrol, Department of Licensing, Traffic Safety Commission. I also work on general transportation policy issues for the governor. Some of you may also work with John Snyder, who does outdoor recreation. And as you know, cycling and pedestrian walking is a big part of our outdoor recreation. And so there are some overlaps that John and I work very closely together. Prior to being at the governor's office, I spent almost 10 years at the House of Representatives as both nonpartisan as well as partisan staff to the Transportation Committee, and also was the WSDOT Legislative Relations Director for about a year or so. So I'm happy to be here and hope for a great discussion.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, well, we're going to jump in with some questions and discussion time, and then we will be gathering questions from our attendees. So just a reminder to continue to put your questions into the chat bar. I've seen some already, so thank you. So we're just going to start off with the fact that there has been ongoing work happening on transportation revenue package over the last couple years, beginning in 2019 and then moving into this last session, the 2020 legislative session. And there were a handful of hearings that happened on the transportation revenue proposal coming from the Senate Transportation Committee and led by Chair Hobbs. And so we've heard a bit about it. It hasn't made it through the process to date, which is very common for a package of this size. But I think we're interested in hearing how this work has progressed since the 2020 session. And I know that will be a little different for each of you as you have different connections to what's being proposed here, looking forward to transportation revenue and identifying priorities. And I think this question could also be focused on even just the process of putting together a proposal. You know, it's no small feat to come up with your list of needs, the overarching goals, potential revenue sources, but also ensuring that you'll have broad support among legislators. And so we'll start with Senator Saldaña on this one, since the Senate has put forth the first proposal we've seen, and would love to just hear a bit about that, but also some of the work that you've done on identifying needs and potential revenue.
All right, thank you. So as I had mentioned in my opening remarks, is that the Senate took majority in 2018 when Senator Dingra joined the Senate. And at that time, Senator Hobbs, was saying, how do we show leadership as Democrats, and that our transportation revenue is based on gas tax, which thankfully, because we have made commitments to fuel efficiency, more folks are choosing electric vehicles. We've had an uptick, we've had investments in light rail, and that has resulted in people making choices to use their cars less or to become car free and use bike, walking, and other modes of transportation. One consequence of that is that we have lower revenues. The other piece is that we've had some really big packages, and usually transportation packages maybe come around every decade. But we had a couple that came quickly, all on top of each other, and all that depended on high bonding. So now we have before we had about 7% of the revenues that we collected went to bonding. Today, and for the last few years, it has now increased up to about 20%. And so what he was noticing is that we didn't have the funding. We've bought some big projects. Some of those were really necessary, but we also don't have as much revenue for preservation and maintenance. And we also have less money to be able to apply to our multimodal funds, to our ferries. On top of that, he saw that there was unrest with voters, because this was pre-976, but already people are very frustrated about what they felt were multiple fees coming to them, particularly car drivers, but everyone feeling this, the revenue challenges and taxes. And so, he was looking like, what are other options before us? And then the last piece would be culverts, because this was pre-COVID, but when we built our highway system 100+ years ago, we built in ways that was really about how to get from point A to point B and really our freight, without necessarily thinking about salmon and waterways and making sure that we have clean air, clean water, and we just cemented over all kinds of waterways that are essential to the rights of our sovereign nations in Washington state. And so they sued us and they won. And we have, as a state, it is our job as taxpayers and as representatives of the state to be responsible to undoing the harms of those culverts and making sure that we're building our transportation system to be more resilient moving forward and to meet the different needs that people have. And so those were all the reasons why he was looking to put forward a proposal. So that was called Forward Washington. It's still built very much on this idea of making sure that there's enough votes, which is a critical part of it. We are a democracy and we have 49 senators and we have 98 representatives, and we have to get enough, especially if we're going to bonding. There has to be 2/3 of us need to agree that we're willing to take this vote and make this investment. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting more connectivity, more safety, cleaner air, and more resilience. And these are issues that are important to me. So so he had that out there. It was very bold. It was, a lot of hearings in 2019. Yes. And then in 2020, it's a short session. So we are on a 2-year cycle, I think, just to make sure people know, because I know you're all busy, and I didn't track any of this before I became a senator. I was an advocate working on trying to get equitable transit-oriented development along the Rainier Valley and in Chinatown and International District, and working on buses and making sure we didn't have bus cuts. So just to step back, right, we have a 2-year budget. And so he proposed that. So last year it was still there alive as a proposal, but we also then had 976. And during session, we all started to understand, but none of us, for sure, not me, had any real understanding of what COVID and this pandemic would be. And so, those became the top priorities of just making sure we're not going backwards and having a very lean budget this last year, and knowing that we have to come back. We all thought we'd have this interim to like collaborate, and we are doing it, but in a very different way, to come back with a real, more meaningful, thoughtful way that we would actually move forward. So I will say this last year, my contribution was, along with Representative Shoemake, is to introduce Transportation for All. And it was a bill to talk about, if we're moving forward, rather than thinking about packages and just buying fancy new things, let's make sure we're building an investment plan that is going to bring sustainability and deliver the kind of transportation system that communities and individuals and businesses want, that will get them their things and their ideas to the different places when they want them to be there, and in the mode that they want to, in a safe way that they're actually going to arrive there. So it would do what we do with bikes, and you guys know this. We have grant programs that for bikes, for freight, for walking routes to school, and so you have to meet certain criteria, and then we have to figure out how do we fund further down there. But with the road and highway system and the bridges, it doesn't work in that same way. Like each of them has to like make its case, like it should be there. So what I was hoping is that we could introduce these kinds of metrics, have them scored, then we figure out like, you know, where's the most urgent, what's going to make the biggest difference. And then it's our job as the legislators and, you know, to figure out how we get that revenue and how far down we can fund to put together something that will make a difference. So that is where we are, is looking at how to, you know, and having conversations with folks. I'll pause it. I talked a lot. I'll let Representative Slatter add from the House perspective, and then I think I'll be looking in the chat too and taking cues of how we get there. So I'll pause.
I'm so glad you did that, Senator Saldaña, because it is a very complicated thing to pass a budget, because it has to pass the Senate and it has to pass the House and get to the governor's desk, and it has to be something that we think about, or thoughtful about, and really consider. And I have to say that Senator Saldaña has been really a leader in trying to rethink transportation as a system. I always say that transportation is a map of our lives. And yet the budget doesn't always seem to address that evolving change. I know that within the budget, there are places where we try to do that. But overall, we are sort of, if you think about constructing a bridge or think about constructing a roadway or a highway, it takes a long time. So the agility and flexibility to move with the way people move is not always evident, and is always a real struggle. But I think if we start to look at metrics like Senator Saldaña is talking about, I think we can start to see that we are valuing it, you know, really important ways that we connect in our lives, and they're really changing. We're valuing climate, and we're valuing our clean air and less pollution. We're valuing our health. We are valuing the idea that we want to be safe when we travel. You know, when you listen to Secretary Millar, he often says that 40% of trips that we take are less than 5 miles from where we live, and around 28% are less than 1 mile from where we live. I think when you talk to families with young kids, when you talk to commuters, people who are not really interested in owning a car, even double income couples and families that don't have a car because they live in urban settings, they want to ride the bus, they want to be able to, take part in their own society, in their own community. We have to start rethinking how we address and pay for the different transportation infrastructure. I'm in a district right now that's going to see around 25,000 new workers next year in the first or second quarter. They're not going to come specifically from my district, but there is going to be a lot of people. There are going to be a lot of people trying to get to work here potentially. Now, mind you, with COVID, work could look a little different, right? Connectivity and mobility could look different when we are thinking about teleworking, for example, maybe 2 days a week, maybe 5 days a week, and looking at how schools are online. So that all has to be taken into account. but there are roadways that are needed to be used for cars, for buses, and for bikes. But when you're on a bike, you want to feel safe. You want to feel protected. And for people who would like to get on a bike and travel but aren't expert at it, we need to be able to build that type of infrastructure. So just to answer quickly the question that Alex, you asked, how is the House doing this? Well, right now, we don't really know exactly the best way to do this. So what we're doing is we're having listening sessions, and we're going to meet with 80 to 100 stakeholder meetings. These are hour-and-a-half meetings, and forgive me, there's some work going on outside. Hopefully you can hear me. But these are hour-and-a-half long meetings where we talk about the budget challenges and really get feedback. And in fact, we just had one with Washington Bikes. You have a really active and engaged organization that is working with us, and we're just doing a lot of listening at the moment. So this is a really good time to be reaching out to Washington Bikes and to mention the things that you want. I'm really interested to hear that today. And I can add a little bit more about the budget as we go through the next questions, Alex, because I think Debbie can really give us some more feedback.
Great, thank you. And Debbie, we would love to hear, I know that the governor's role is a little bit different than, than the chambers, but would love to hear perspectives on goals for the governor for future transportation budgets.
Sure. Thanks again for having me. And the governor recognizes the need in our transportation system are growing. And he has supported investments in the past and will continue to support investments in a safe, reliable transportation system. And that system includes ferries, transit, rail, bicycle, pedestrian infrastructure, as well as maintaining and preserving our existing roadway system. As Senator Saldaña mentioned, we do have a backlog in preservation and maintenance. It's quite large and it's growing every year that we keep putting it off. And the governor recognizes that and is interested in trying to figure out how to do better with our preservation and maintenance. Governor also recognizes we do have some needs for highway improvements across the state. For example, the I-5 bridge between Washington and Oregon is a critical piece of our infrastructure. And that about a year ago, in November of last year, I believe it was, maybe early December, he and Oregon's Governor Kate Brown signed a memorandum of agreement to jumpstart the work on that bridge. Now, the legislature also has been very engaged in that process with a new joint state by a coalition that's working together. And so there's a lot of energy around recognizing that that bridge is critical for our infrastructure. So that's an example of one of the key infrastructure pieces that the governor is concerned about and is looking for. How do we move forward with this bridge? There is a funding issue, to be completely honest, with that bridge, as we all know. The governor is also committed to identifying resources, as Senator Saldaña mentioned, to keep WashDOT moving forward on progress towards meeting the court injunction, which requires the states to significantly increase the effort to remove state-owned culverts that block habitat for salmon by 2030. He is very committed to keeping us on track to meet that goal. There is a need for, I think it's about $700 million next biennium to keep us on our progress towards meeting that goal. So that is a part of what we're looking at, is how do we solve for that. He has also provided leadership with regards to electrification of our transportation sector. As you all know, transportation sector is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And working with the legislature, he has secured funding to convert 2 ferries from diesel to hybrid electric, and has also found funding to build a new fully electric 144 car ferry. Now, the ferry system is one of the highest fuel consumers in our state. So that is actually, those investments will help to make a difference in our state impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And the governor is continuing to look at where else can we do more with electrification of our transportation sector. Speaking to this group, I think it's important to mention that the governor continues to be committed to investments in multimodal programs, and that includes bicycle and pedestrian programs. As you may recall, we've already talked about the impact of I-976 last November, and the governor's budget assumed a reduction in revenues, as did the legislature, with the initiative. Yet his proposed budget that he put out last December protected bicycle and pedestrian safety programs, given his commitment to maintaining projects that improve safety for those users. I-976 did create quite a challenge for us all, and but there were some things that were non-negotiable, if you will, with the governor, and Safety for bicyclists and pedestrians was one of those, and I think the legislature agreed with that, and the final budget did protect those programs. But similar to what's been said, we are sort of in a wait and see. We need more information, and we're beginning to identify options given all of the unknowns. And by unknowns, I mean, what is going to be the impact of COVID-19 on transportation? We do have a revenue forecast that comes out recently. I think it was last week, the most recent revenue forecast came out. We have seen a decrease in vehicle miles traveled, which equates to a decrease in gas tax. We have seen a decrease in ferry fares, which our ferry system runs 70% of our operating costs are paid by ferry fares. So that has an impact on our budget. We are seeing a decrease in toll revenues. Those toll revenues are used to pay back bonds that we have due on some of our tolled facilities. They're used to pay for maintenance and preservation, and they're used to pay for improvements in those tolled corridors. So we are waiting for pieces of information, including the November forecast. Now, the governor's budget will come out in December, and the governor will use the November forecast. So we might see some changes in what sorts of revenues we can expect to come in the next 2 years. And then we'll use that information to create his budget proposal. The other big one that Senator Saldaña and Representative Slatter have mentioned is, what is the court going to decide on 976? If the court upholds the initiative, that creates a different set of policy options and budget decisions than if the court rejects or overturns the initiative. So we are looking at trying to figure out, like, what if it goes in either direction? What sorts of decisions do we have to make here at the governor's office? So we are looking forward to hearing more about those kinds of those pieces of information. And I do have to mention, we are watching very closely the federal government. You know, will there be a relief package? If there's a relief package that helps with our operating budget deficit, we right now have, I think it's $4 or $5 billion. I could be wrong about how much the revenue forecast has dipped on the operating side. That does impact the decisions the legislature and the governor have to make. So we are keeping our eye on that. Will we see relief in the transportation area or even in the operating budget area? And how does that impact all of those decisions? So those are just some of the budget kind of things and some of the governor's priorities, always committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, figuring out ways to improve our climate, really committed to culverts, really committed to looking at ways to keep moving forward with our multimodal programs and not let 976 take a big cut in those areas. And also, I do want to close with a couple things. Senator Saldaña mentioned the process and outcomes with regards to looking at our state transportation goals. Are they the right goals? What's missing? What do we need to clarify? And then developing some sort of metrics when we're making decisions about where our funding is going. Governor is very interested in that process, and I think WashDOT is working on, with the help of Senator Saldaña and a proviso in the budget, on a process to kind of get us some more information about what that might look like. And then also, where do we have opportunities to leverage what we're seeing right now? Teleworking is up. We do have a broadband issue, so maybe we need to be looking at that. But teleworking is a great way to reduce VMTs and greenhouse gas emissions. Increase in cycling, that is up. How do we leverage that? As Representative Slatter said, we're really wanting to hear from the experts, which many of you are here today. What are the best things? Where can we get our best bang for our buck to be able to leverage these opportunities and improve safety for those users too at the same time? So that sort of is an overview of where we are at the governor's office. Different place. I don't have specifics. His budget comes out in December, and that's when you will probably know more about how he's approaching these big challenges we have. But he's very aware of what's going on, and we're being very thoughtful and looking at as many options as we can.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to move us into a new question that has been touched on quite a few times here. So, so maybe this one will be a brief. You can briefly address this, but as has been mentioned, the September state transportation revenue forecast indicated a worsening situation for our state's transportation budget. And, you know, as bike advocates in Washington Bikes, we are fully prepared to come to the 2021 session ready to advocate for an increase in funding and further investments and maybe new investments for bike and pedestrian infrastructure. But I do think it's really important to set the context of what the deficits and the strain that the legislature will have to be balancing and addressing. And so the items have come up even pre-COVID and our economic slowdown. We had the I-976 passage. And so, so I think that one specifically, when you're talking about the multimodal account, where for attendees who aren't familiar, the multimodal account in the transportation budget is where the majority of bike, walk, and transit funding come from. And so I think we're really curious, you know, what are we facing if we don't come up with new transportation revenue, and if we aren't able to agree on a new package and proposal. And then the other item that was touched on was culverts. So I'm not sure who wants to jump. This is a big question, but if you could just speak to the strain that we're facing.
Yeah, I'm happy to start if that's okay. So thank you for setting that up. I think that we have some really good voices on the call that can fill in some of the gaps that I might have here. But so when we look at the strain that we're facing, what's the lay of the land? I-976 made a huge impact on multimodal investment. It was really devastating, frankly. And when we see the COVID impact on top of it, the numbers we're looking at are about $650 million COVID impact, which means that's what Debbie was talking about with decreased revenue, a toll revenue, ferry fares, et cetera. Then we see about a 600 to 700, probably closer to $700 million impact on multimodal funding, which is I-976 related. It used to be about 500 million last year, but with this impact, we're starting to see a further depth in that. The other thing that we're looking at is culverts. That's a $3 billion over 10 years commitment, essentially, that we're making because of the courts that we have to fulfill. And when you look at the dollars year on year over the biennium, you're looking around a $650 million impact over this biennium as well. So and then the forecast that Alex referred to, we look at the general fund forecast, and then we also look at transportation forecasts. And there is actually an upside on the general fund forecast that looked like we were actually coming back a little bit better and our budget gap was less. But on the transportation side, it actually went deeper, and we lost another $80 million in that forecast. So we're looking at close to, I don't know, $1.5 to $2 billion hole over the next couple of years that we have to fill, over the next number of years at least. One of the good things about the transportation budget is we can actually spread out some of the costs, but it's not very easy to do because ultimately things are still due. So we're trying to fill that with different revenue than gas tax. And well, gas tax will always be part of the story because right now we don't see an adequate replacement, although we are hearing about road usage charge, which is something that we're studying. But we're going to need to look at new revenue. And I can see in the questions that you've been asking here that you're very cognizant of that. And it is exactly right. And one of the places that we are looking at is carbon. You know, pricing carbon and looking to see whether that might have some sector-specific revenue support for transportation, because as Debbie said, 45% or so in Bellevue, it's 47% greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. So how do we now layer all of our different funding, knowing, and we're making the assumption in the House that I-976 will hold. Because I think that we want to make the most conservative assumption that we can. So just to sort of set that stage, I think, Alex, you were sort of asking, you know, what are we looking at? So everything's on the table at least in the House, because we want to understand where are we going to get dollars? How do we remove car taps as an option, for example? That's one thing we're thinking about. And where do we go for that revenue going forward that actually is in line with some of our own goals and needs and impacts that we're facing? So I will pause there and let other folks jump in.
Well, I'm just reading all the questions. They're amazing. I love these questions. So, and so I'm like trying to focus. Okay. But I think, you know, in terms of revenues is what I'm going to talk about. I think I'm kind of jumping from just kind of pick up on what Representative Slatter is and a couple of the different questions there. So one is a price on carbon, but a price on carbon, as we mentioned earlier, 44% of our pollution of carbon is coming from transportation. So, you know, depending on what, you know, there was a proposal that both Senator Hobbs and my proposals, you know, consider just a price on carbon for the transportation sector, since we had just done something with everything else. But I think given COVID and all the general funds, we're back to, I think, a bigger conversation of a price on carbon, and then what proportion of that would come to transportation. The other revenues, and I'll just mention, I don't know, some of you may already know that there's been a coalition on Climate Alliance for clean transportation. And so that is a growing coalition, and partnering with them, some of the revenues that we came up with that are also being considered. So there's a joint transportation committee. Your organization is part of monitoring and being part of that, a Blue Ribbon Commission. So they are looking at all kinds of revenues. And one that I have been championing is the idea of air quality excise tax. So at the time of a purchase of a new vehicle, they would put on what is the total cost, that carbon cost of this new vehicle, and put a one-time fee on that. And so, because as I'm seeing in the chat, right, is there's a difference. Like when people electrify their one vehicle, they're still choosing to be in a single vehicle, and they're still driving as much or as little on our public transportation system that we have built out. And it does have a wear and tear, maybe less, maybe not, depending on the weight, right? And so when, you know, we have some fees on those, I think there is concerns about how do we make sure that we're providing the right incentive, because an electrical vehicle, even if it's a single vehicle, still better than a really gas guzzler that has bad emissions. But to the point in a lot of the comments, if people are able to choose a public transportation or be able to choose a e-bike or a regular bike, good old fashioned BMX to get them where they need to go, then, you know, those are definitely, they still have a wear and tear. They're still using our public infrastructure, but definitely not the same way. And I think the other piece, when we put a metrics in, if we're doing like my goal is to do targeted universalism and apply that wherever we can. And to the question that was brought up about ADA compliance and how, you know, we are so far behind in getting our system up. I live in a part of our city where we don't have sidewalks, right? And with COVID, we have all these kids out on the streets, and there's not enough sideway to be able to put sidewalks in. And actually, there's part of me is like, why are we going to add more cement and pavement? You know, but how do we create it's a small road that our public bus goes on, that a lot of people speed on, that kids and folks are walking on and rolling on? Like, how do we make that safe? So thinking about innovation is like, is it with paint? Is it like, you know, plantings? Like, how do we make these spaces so that they can be more accessible to people of all means? And, you know, so if we don't put curbs in, there's not that barrier of a curb. And so as we are both thinking about the places where there are barriers and we need to remove them, so many other parts of our town, from, you know, looking at Yakima, looking in rural communities, looking at, you know, my neighborhood, like where we never got the pavement in the first place. And that's still what people want. But can we, as transportation practitioners, come up with really nice, thoughtful solutions that it doesn't feel like, oh, just because we're in a poorer neighborhood, or we have less been divested in, now you're going to give us, you know, this. Like, how do we actually make it? That is the thing that all of us want to be striving for. And how do we put it first in communities that have been divested from historically? And I think those are all questions. I think that besides air quality surcharge and carbon, can people still hear me? Okay, good. I just saw like a freeze. And so I wasn't sure if it was on my end or someone else's, but I think it's Alex's. So, okay. You know, I think we're also looking at the road usage charge. So we have put provisos in to explore this idea of some kind of road usage, because if we can't collect it at the gas tank, then how do we collect something where those that are using it, using the system, are able to contribute to it? And so we did our Washington State Transportation Commission successfully secured a large grant from the federal government to continue exploring how do we do that in an equitable way? How could we be progressive in how we apply that? Because a lot of lower income folks have had to drive to qualify. So now where their house is so much further away from their employment and their faith home and their community homes. And so they drive more. So, and of course, in rural communities, everything's a lot farther away just to get to your grocery store, to your hospital. So how would we build that in a way that, considers equity from those different perspectives and still then builds in a resilient fund? So I think we are looking for all kinds of options, as Representative Slatter said, because I think we all believe that moving forward, we need multiple types of funds, but that make sense to the taxpayer, but also then build in more resiliency so that when one part of our economy or our community falls apart, we then don't end up completely in a hole. Yeah, I feel like there's one little piece, but I'll let Debbie pick up from here, and then I'm sure we'll keep on riffing off each other.
I'm just going to go very high level on this one. And it's really interesting to hear Representative Slatter and Senator Saldaña and all the work that they are doing. And I know the chairs are doing and other members of the legislature are doing on transportation revenue. One of the things that's interesting, having been through the Connecting Washington days, which that package, as Alex mentioned, it does take a couple of years typically. I remember, I think that took 3 or 4 years. Let's go with 3. But one of the things that's interesting about this conversation about revenue is, and maybe it's because of 976, or maybe it's because we are just looking at our transportation system more holistically, is this conversation about identifying flexible funding. We are definitely in a place where 976 we've realized, car tabs are not popular, but at the same time, they are our largest source of flexible funding for our multimodal programs, including bicycle and pedestrian projects. Behind that is rental car tax. And rental car tax has not been doing so well since the pandemic hit. So this is definitely a new, it's interesting to hear all the conversations going on and what do we do about our flexible funding, given we are committed to the types of programs and modes that those funds support. So I just wanted to kind of identify that point has been, I think, talked about in different ways in this revenue discussion.
Yeah, and I'll just want to say a little bit on that. The 18th Amendment, is an amendment that was put in place to be able to secure and set aside a certain amount of money, particularly the gas tax at the time, to be able to, so that doesn't get counted against our general fund. So it allows us to bond and have that be separate in terms of debt, so that it keeps our credit good as a state. So I think one thing that's very clear, even when we're just talking about preservation and maintenance, when we're talking about culverts and ferries, what we have in the money that is in the 18th Amendment right now for bonding purposes is too little to cover even those things. And so I think when we're moving forward and looking at these different revenues, each one of them the default should be that it's not, it doesn't have to be in the 18th Amendment. There's both ways that we can expand what gets covered in there. So I think that's always a question that we should have more flexibility in future funding for transportation is definitely where I'm landing on. And we probably, at least in the short term, need all colors of money, no matter, from these different areas going to these core investments, but also the way that we are investing in what we consider our multimodal has got to look different. Just adding 100,000 into these current buckets isn't going to cut it. Like, we actually need to think about rebalancing how we're investing, long term. So if this, any package or any investment plan is you know, we're looking at 10 to 15 years. And so that we're making these commitments now. So the more that we are saying, these are the ideas that we need to fund, and obviously people want to know concretely what kinds of things we're going to do. But I do think that if we can talk to our neighbors about like what we need are these outcomes, and there's different ways we can get to those outcomes. And as we get more technology, as we are building complete streets and building all those things at once, the more that it doesn't make sense to have things separated. Like if we're gonna build on the I-5 bridge, we need to make sure that we're building for safety, whether you're walking, driving, or taking, or biking, or on a light rail, right? And I think that's been a challenge for that community, is the light rail component, but like, it doesn't make sense. We're not gonna move enough bodies safely across that bridge if we don't figure out how we restart that conversation.
Alex, I wonder if could we capture the questions and suggestions in the chat somehow, as well, because I think there's some really good questions and there's also some really interesting ideas. You know, licensing of bikes. I know that came up briefly in our stakeholder meeting, but you know, that's something we should take a look at and see. That's a possibility. Oh, great, thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. So yeah, if you could collect some of these, that would be really good as we're going through our listening sessions. One thing I want to just point out is that, you know, as a bike community, you've been advocating pretty heavily over the course of at least my time in the legislature. And so we have passed some bills and some laws that might be really, you know, powerful, like the, you know, ban the box, like the, you know, the rolling stop on idea that just started. Thank you so much for doing that, for advocating for that. We do have a vulnerable road user bill that we also passed, and I don't remember all the details of it, but somebody was talking about something like that in the chat. And so I just want to really thank you all for, you know, coming out, because one of the things I've learned in the legislature is sometimes we have these really, really big packages, but the other ways that we resolve issues are to take little pieces and kind of chip away and get closer and closer to the goals that we need to get. It doesn't feel super satisfying to see it all in one place, but we've done that with climate, with carbon, with greenhouse gas, sector-specific greenhouse gas impacts and emissions. And so we try to move, you know, the ball down the field, if you will, in other ways. And so, you know, just looking at a big package isn't the only way to do it. And I want to highlight the fact that, for example, on the east side of King County here, we have an East Rail corridor. It's a 42-mile corridor that we're thinking to build that goes through multiple cities and is a bike trail pedestrian path that could also provide business opportunities for people, coffee shops, whatever that is, and get people connected with their community. And that's something that is the partnership with the county, with cities, and with the state. And so being really active in your local government, as well as understanding kind of what these connectivity pathways are. They're not on roads specifically, these are trails. These are pathways that might help kids get to school safely, get to your grocery store safely, help to build out businesses and an economy that is bike specific and pedestrian and walking specific, which is really powerful when we're looking at how government, it can be moved by grassroots organizing, grassroots efforts. So one of the things we did in Bellevue when I was a city council member in 2016, was we had a transportation levy that basically paid for connectivity, because sidewalks and crosswalks and connections that make people feel safer, and those dollars are now being used to implement different bike infrastructure within Bellevue, which is really not the easiest place at all to ride your bike. So I just want to say that sometimes it feels really, really big at the state level, and it's a big, huge package, but what you're doing at the local, county, and level is also really powerful and can help to address and almost move the state in directions that they aren't necessarily thinking about. when we look at big problems and things we're hearing about, we're hearing about the West Seattle Bridge, we're hearing about the I-5 bridge, which is huge. It's a $450 million that we're committed to in the state to be able to build out that bridge. And right now they hand grease all the cranks in order to keep it running and safe right now. And so it's sort of on its last legs. And so these are the things that are coming in front of us from the big projects. But when you're giving us grassroots support on the other end and through cities and counties and some of these other projects, then we start to have to address them as well. So I don't know if that helped to cover some of the ways that you can impact us and how we move, but exactly what you're talking about in the chat is really important.
Thank you so much. So this is Alex. I've come off of video because I'm getting the notice that I have an unstable connection and I don't want to get booted out. So this has been really wonderful, and I thank you for jumping into the chat and actually addressing some of the really great questions that have been popping up. I thought, as you just raised that about ways to engage at the local level, this was kind of a conversation point I was hoping we could get to, and now we've got 5 minutes to go, so maybe briefly we can touch on this. But did want to highlight that out of this COVID-19 crisis, the demand for bicycling has increased significantly. So during these last 6 months of the pandemic, whether people are looking for community alternatives, bicycling allows for easy social distancing. And, when thinking about recreation options, people are so in need of physical and mental health relief right now and turning to hopping on a bike to get active and outdoors. And there's a bicycling boom. You can't even buy bikes in some parts of the country right now. And so while we know some things, once we're post-COVID, will return to life as we knew it before, we're hoping that we can really hold on and capture some of this mode shift. And we're hoping that this rush to active transportation can be something that we have stick around. And so I'm curious, from your perspectives, how do you suggest we leverage this increase? How should we be storytelling and showing up so that our outcome could be greater transportation investment for safe and accessible places for people to access, thinking about the state level?
I mean, one thing that I think is important is none of us are just one thing, right? I mean, we bike, we walk, we take a shared vehicle, we drive. I mean, I think the more that we can help people see themselves not being othered, right? I think is really important because and that bicyclists are children, like so many times the first freedom that you feel is when you ride your bike, if you have the ability to do that, right? Or walk down to the corner store. So I think the more that, I saw Yakima, for instance, like, why, are there bike, and bike proposals not scoring well? How do we, as the broader community, help them be successful? Because if people can feel that they can ride their bike safely in Yakima, in Mattawa, and then it's going to make it easier for all of us to be able to get bikes, right? Like, because Eastern Washington right now, maybe you can tell me, but I don't know that there's champions for biking. From my colleagues that represent a lot, besides Senator Billig. And so definitely Senator Billig's, he's a great bike promoter. But, so I think that would be great for them to feel that connection, that it's not just, I represent Seattle and I love Seattle, but when we go to Olympia, people love to hate us. And so the more that, we're showing up as the full community of bicyclists in Washington State, the more successful we're going to be. So that would be my piece, is just, to show that you're a full person, right? You're a bicyclist and you're all these other things. I think will help them, make those connections.
Great, thank you. And I know we're close to time, but I would love to hear last comments from Rep. Slatter and Debbie as well.
Well, I know that, like I talked about the East Rail Corridor earlier, but I know that companies have donated dollars or provided, offered to spend some dollars to support this. You know, I think all of us have to be engaged in this, and, you know, where we work and play and live, really important. What's also really important is equity, and in our neighborhoods, in our communities where there isn't, you know, there aren't sidewalks and there aren't connections. These are communities that are the most impacted by the pollution of the highways that they might be placed near, but they don't have ways to connect. And some members of our communities who are most impacted don't have time to go to be on a panel or to go to an event or to really speak their voices. And so if you are someone who can speak for them and advocate for them in different settings, it's really important that we hear your voice. Because I know as a city council member and as a state legislator, going to different forums before COVID, we wouldn't see a lot of families with kids, young people that live in underserved communities because they're busy, they have other things, you're busy, you have other things going on in your life. So finding ways to advocate in ways that we get to see and understand, legislators see that there are people in their community. I still remember a forum I was in where it was a lot of seniors at the forum, and it was people who had the time to be engaged in, you know, in discourse, civil discourse. And I had a young woman come up to me at the very end of a panel, and she said, you know, I'm a mom, I have 3 kids, I ride a bike, and I'd like to be able to take my kids with me, you know, take them to school, I'd like to be able to ride around with them, you know, and the roads just aren't safe. And could you do something about that, you know? And she was like asking me quietly at the end of a session. That's not, you know, that's not necessarily the only way to, you know, for us to hear. So, you know, the stories, I think what you've heard from Senator Saldaña. I know we're getting tight on time, so I'll just let Debbie have the last word.
Okay, I unmuted Pew. Sorry, I very quickly thank you for those comments, Senator Saldaña and Representative Slatter. I think that those are spot on. I would also just reiterate something we've heard is that we have a revenue problem for sure. That's a budget issue, but I think there's a lot of space in the policy area. Like, what sorts of, you guys have been great at advocating for great bicycle changes to policy to help with bicycle safety. So where are some opportunities that you can still move that agenda forward and share those stories so that we are not forgetting that there are some good things that we could probably do in that arena that are not necessarily tied to a budget or a revenue challenge. So I just think that you guys are good at that. Keep that up. Keep us informed. You're the experts. So I just don't want to lose sight of those making progress on other non-budget issues during challenging budget time.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists for joining us this morning for this really great conversation. And thank you to our engaged attendees as well. We will be capturing all of the comments. As has been mentioned, the solutions to transportation revenue and the needs are being worked on right now. So we will make sure that some of these ideas are, passed along to our transportation leaders. So thank you for joining us this morning. This was really a pleasure. I appreciate it.